Morning, everyone. I welcome you all to another Table Talk, which is a series of conversations with academics and writers who work and write on animal-human relations. We are the Indian Animal Studies Collective. I'm Susan Harris. My co-host Anu Pandey is also here. We aim to bring together writers and activists who are working on animals in India. Today we have with us Jeffrey Nicolaisen, and we'll discuss his essay "Why the Caged Bird Sings: Rethinking the Anthropocene" with Gallus. The talk is going to be recorded and it'll be available on the website and on YouTube. But it is also a very informal conversation, a discussion. So feel free to ask a question at any point. Please don't wait till the end to intervene. I thought, Jeffrey, we could start the conversation by talking about what you're trying to do with the essay, because I remember reading this, I think it was an edited collection called Animals in the Anthropocene, and it was trying to, and I think the general tone of that book was that we need to think about animals in the Anthropocene because humans are connected to animals and we're all interconnected. But I feel like you're trying to say something else with your essay. So, for those who have not read the essay, could you just tell us a bit about it?
Yeah, sure. Thank you for that introduction, Susan, and thanks for having me today at the Indian Animal Studies Collective. It's a pleasure to be here. Um, what I'm trying to do here, I think there's several things that I'm trying to do here. I mean, first, I think is very similar to what you were talking about with the animals in the Anthropocene collection, which is to, I mean, I think the purpose for many people in humanities about using the concept of the Anthropocene is that it is breaking down the binary between humans and nature. And I'm not convinced that it's actually doing that. I think in a lot of ways, it's reinforcing the binary between humans and nature. I mean, I think just the name of Anthropocene, it's really focused on humans, right? But um, there's many other species that are in relation, like you mentioned, with the animals in the Anthropocene collection. But I think there's also something else that I've been thinking about a lot, and I think in decolonial studies in general and cultural studies and I mean larger movements in humanities and humanistic social sciences is that there's a big focus on power and agency. And I do talk about power and agency, and I think those are important things. But I think that there is less focus on um, welfare and ethics. And a lot of the discussion of ethics that does exist, and there is, it ties into power or in post-human scholarship with big thinkers like Donna Haraway, she integrates it with like being with other animals, but not a lot about suffering or welfare of other species. And I think that when we look at, the so-called progress through capitalism, um, although anthropologists often focus on uh, what is causing power differentials among humans because of capitalism, there's a lot less focus, I think, on okay, well, in many cases, capitalism makes things better for humans. Of course, there's exceptions to that, but development although criticized heavily in critical theory, it does bring material wealth to a greater portion of the world, but the trade-off for that is much greater suffering for non-humans. And just the idea that Gallus, or the chicken, its biomass is like, I think it was 3 times the biomass of all other bird species combined now. So it's the majority of birds on the earth, probably the most numerous species of birds in the history of the earth, and they're all confined and domesticated in such a way that they're forced to suffer throughout their life. So in an earlier version, I was trying to think about how to deal with this aspect, because I don't think there's a lot of treatment of uh, this kind of ethics and suffering in post-human scholarship, but I put it in there. So I think that may be a difference than, just talking about agency, relationality, power dynamics, etc.
Yeah, that's really helpful. And when we've had conversations just here amongst between ourselves, too, this has been one of the issues that we keep confronting too, because multi-species scholarships, they do such a good job of showing how we are entangled, but they seem to not focus on the ethical aspects. And what do you, I mean, I know that you don't, that's not the focus of your article, but just out of curiosity, why do you think that is? Do you think that is partly because so much energy is expended in just describing entanglement and describing how we're all connected, that the ethical kind of goes out of the picture? Or is it because, and you talk about this, and I thought that this was a really interesting point when you say that in capitalist societies, humans are also in precarious states and they're forced to do these horrible things to other non-humans. So in that way, the ethical is kind of pushed out too, because there is no other way, especially in places like in the global south, for example, where the question of livelihood is so connected to living off of these animals. So then, why do you think this question of ethical kind gets pushed out?
That's a good question. And I think there's probably many, many reasons. But I think the humanities has been focused on decolonial studies and um, Foucault and critical theory and Marxism. And there's reason for that, and they're interconnected, because I think a lot of the project of work in the social sciences and humanities, especially humanistic social sciences, since around the 1970s, with the publication of Orientalism by Said and Talal Assad's work, um, along with Foucault and other scholars publishing in the 1970s, were pushing back against, colonialism. And it was a period of decolonialism, right, following World War II. So that was a natural and important topic to address at that time. Um, but if you focus only on that topic, I think that other topics tend to get obfuscated. And I think that the ethics or the suffering, I mean, if power is foregrounded, then it becomes kind of an ethical system or a presumptive ethical system that we're focused on equality, which is actually what I write about in my dissertation. I write about the concept of equality. And equality is good for certain things. Um, but, the human rights, animal rights, even too, and the equality perspective uh, is not as much focused on suffering and welfare type of issues, which I think have been like obfuscated by the focus on power. That's my interpretation, and I think there's a lot more than that, but that's that's kind of some things I've been thinking about recently.
Could you tell me a bit more about that? What do you mean that the focus on power kind of obfuscates the ethical? Because I'm thinking about uh, a lot of people using Foucault to talk about biopolitics, for example, and that's
Yeah.
an easy way to talk about, uh, and easy in the sense it's a very clear way to talk about how animal bodies are also controlled to serve the state, to serve humans, and so on. But I feel like I'm missing on something here, and you're probably meaning something else.
Excuse me. Yes. I mean, I think an ethical system needs to have some sort of focus. Um, I sense that the focus on equality or power is more of a deontological ethics where you're talking about rights in many cases. And so it's really common in social sciences. I mean, in social sciences, for example, in anthropology, I mean, we want to talk about cultural relativism. And if you do something, think about cultural relativism, what you're supposed to do in some way is to set aside your own moral or ethical system to examine a moral or ethical system of another culture. And that's what cultural relativism is. But at the same time, in anthropology, early anthropologists were used to uh, be agents of the imperial system. And so, because of that role, then, they may research uh, people that were colonized and then report back to the state, and the state would be able to better control these people. And so the response to that has been, um, first of all, human rights, which is, a form of liberalism, which has become the global standard for dealing with equality, I think. And there is some pushback against liberalism from people like Elizabeth Povinelli, who's talking about liberalism and some things. But um, human rights and equality is a deontological ethics, which is not focused on welfare as much as, say, a consequentialist ethics as utilitarianism, which is focused more on welfare and suffering. So even though I think that anthropologists try to set aside ethical views, when you go and do anthropological research, at least with the systems that were started in the United States and spread across the world, like I'm working in Taiwan, and they emulate the United States system of the institutional review board system, which is a consent-based system, which is consent and deontology and human rights, I think, kind of all go together, right? So the way that you protect people is to get their consent and not to violate their rights. But all of this just to get someone's consent and to not violate their rights doesn't mean you're actually thinking about the welfare of that person. That's not central to the ethical system. What's central is consent and this idea of everybody has rights. And, you know, rights are a difficult thing to speak out against because they are taken for granted as a default ethical system, but they have their problems. And one of the problems is that if you have a human rights-based system and you protect the rights of humans, then animals and non-humans don't have any rights. So the humans will um, always be put before non-humans in every case. And I think that this liberal system, for all of the good that it's done, also is part of the system that is um, gradually eroding the ecological systems and the animal uh, uh, flourishing that could otherwise be going on because they're not protected by this right system. And I mean, we wrote about this actually with my partner, who I think introduced you to my work, Ambika Ayadurai, and we did a collection on the rights of nature. And so that's thinking about, you know, how do you give rights to non-humans, to mountains or rivers or national parks, this type of thing. But again, what we learn through doing that work is that most cultures don't have any concept of rights. So what you're doing is when you're using this concept of rights, it fits into an international legal system that was created by countries like the United States and England and France and colonial powers, and trying to put other ethical systems into it. So, and this is all related to power. It's all related to power. And so I think that when you forefront power, it's different than forefronting um, suffering. I mean, any ethical system has to focus on something. And the power issue doesn't always get to suffering, although they're often very much interrelated, but not exactly the same thing.
That's really helpful too, Jeffrey. I thought I'd ask you to one of the really interesting sections in the essays when you talk about the history of Gallus Gallus and how there's so much that's gone into making the highly advanced version, so to speak, that we have today. And in fact, when we had, I think it was Yamini Narayanan, when we had her in a previous table talk, she also talks about, I think she quotes somebody in the Indian government who talks about the cow in a very similar way of being this highly efficient instrument, right? And so, could you tell us, in on one hand, the chicken is made this really effective instrument of productivity, of factory farming, and so on. But on the other hand, people still have to kind of confront the fact that the chicken is a living being. Uh, could you tell us a bit about this tension that is really at the heart of your essay?
Yeah, that is at the heart of my essay. It's the chickens, Gallus Gallus, they're treated as tools. I mean, really, through the production system and the development of the particular hybrids through the Chickens of Tomorrow campaign in the United States, starting in 1945. Um, so I think in that campaign, the chickens as life, I mean, chickens as um, suffering, living beings that have some form of life as in terms of feeling, that was completely ignored. And of course, everybody, I mean, it's so common to just say, okay, that's a Cartesian system, or it comes from Christianity, which of course many Christians have pushed back on, or science. And there's a lot of things that are interlocking there, but whatever all those things are, like, it's expressed in this campaign where everything um, is about increasing productive capacity. And it's just really jaw-dropping that in a 50-year period of time from the 1950s to the 2000s, that chickens on average can be 5 times the weight that they were 50 years earlier, and that animals that in captive conditions prior to the genetic breeding, they could live for 12 years in a good captive environment. And now, if they live to 56 days, I think that was the number in the article, 100% of them, virtually 100% of broiler chickens, they can't walk anymore. And they're suffering from leg pain, and they can't move. They're suffering from leg pain. Their hearts can't keep up. They're panting. I mean, basically, they're not designed to live to 56 days. Like, they're designed to live to 40 days so that they can be slaughtered at the optimum weight. It's not the highest weight they may achieve, but what they're really trying to optimize here is profits, because more chickens will die in the process, more chickens will get sick, and of course they started using antibiotics to increase production, and they used other nutrients like vitamin D to deal with weak leg syndrome. Um, but the entire system is developed to maximize profit. And that is, the function of the capitalist system, that it forces productivity. So if there were some people that were concerned about the welfare of the animals, and they had chickens that were not producing as much meat, then they wouldn't be able to compete on the open market. So, um, so it pushes those that are less interested in welfare, or not interested in the welfare of the chickens at all, to succeed in the marketplace. And I think that's clearly also an illustration of the fact that there's no consideration of the suffering component here. So yeah, I mean, I think that's kind of what was happening, mainly from 1945. I mean, I could talk. There's a lot of details in that story, so I can talk in more detail on other things if you have questions about that. But I guess that's my initial response.
Yeah. Anu, you want to jump in now?
Yeah, thanks, Susan. Jeffrey, your article is really powerful and also overwhelming because of the sheer scale involved that you bring to light, these staggeringly high numbers. Um, and I was overwhelmed. But at the same time, I also really liked how you show that humans and animals, the chickens, are caught up in the same systems, the technosphere, the domus, both of them shaping as well as being shaped by them. And I wanted to ask you whether you see any real possibilities for breaking or bending those systems from within, or would you say that the recognition of entanglement is itself the only viable ethical stance that we can have?
Uh, yeah, that's a difficult question. I mean, I guess entanglement, I don't see entanglement as an ethical stance necessarily. I think entanglement is a statement about the reality of the way the world is. And you talked about the domus. You mentioned the domus, which comes from James Scott work, and I think that he's not arguing about entanglement from the normative perspective as much as the physical reality um, about the way that the world works. So for those of us that maybe didn't read the paper or may not know what the domus is, it's just this idea that when we talk about domestication, we often think of humans as domesticating others, so humans being subject and others being object. But actually, civilization, as it developed, was not primarily only humans. Actually, there were many species involved in a kind of community that James Scott calls the domus. And that not only included animals that humans eat, but it can also include species like rats, for example, that that feed on humans' waste, you could say, or just scraps around human civilization. Dogs also, we suspect, were attracted to human settlements by the food waste that was produced. But there are even scholars that argue that dogs domesticated humans rather than humans domesticating dogs, because we had to make these relationships, for example, in hunting. Um, and so these relationships have always existed. And I think that's one of the problems with the concept of the Anthropocene. And that's why I bring up this kind of entanglement concept, because Anthropocene is saying that humans are becoming a geological force. And that's why we're integrated into uh, the world ecosystem. And that what has made humans a geological force is what's happened since the beginning of this concept of the Anthropocene, maybe around 1945, maybe earlier. There's a lot of dispute about that, but the technological development that occurred. But talking about the domus and the entanglement is talking about a different set of fact patterns than the Anthropocene scholarship, because we're looking at, look, humans are not the only agents that are involved in the Anthropocene in creating this new world. Actually, a lot of what's going on is humans are doing things, but other species like chickens are doing things, and we're reacting to each other in entanglement with each other. And yeah, I don't see that exactly as an ethical claim as much as a factual claim, but I'd be interested to hear more about how you see entanglement as an ethical claim too, or I don't know if that at least gives a start of an answer to your question.
Yes, it absolutely does. It clarifies certain things that I was thinking about while reading your essay. Um, and then along with that, I mean, I meant as an ethical stance, as a kind of a recognition of the entanglement. Is that the best we can do, or is there any other kind of intervention that would arise in terms of political interventions, ethical interventions that one can think about, that one can imagine happening, if not right away, then, slowly going forward, if one orients oneself by the way you've described the sort of relationship that Homo sapiens and Gallus share, as being, embedded or subjected to the same systems. But yes, your answer helped think along those lines. And then I had another question. Um, the idea of the Gallus is really interesting as well, because it takes on this, this sort of concept of the Anthropocene, which has dominated the way we've thought about the human the human and his environment, or the humans and animals, etc., for the longest possible time now. And that was already a kind of, shall we say, radical idea when it first came about, because it helped us to critically think about a lot of things. The idea of human exceptionalism itself. And in your essay, you break down that line of thought where you show that the Anthropocene might not be the only story to tell. Since as a narrative, it really does reinforce human exceptionalism. So, whatever we were using the concept of the Anthropocene to break down for, is being reinstated, so to speak, by the term Anthropocene. And the idea that you suggest, that of the Galusine, is, it seems at the same time, and I think you say that in your essay as well, that it seems at once playful, but also deeply serious, as it leads us to reorient how we think about scale and how we think about responsibility. Um, what do you think we would gain by imagining other scenes? So if we say Anthropocene is the first one and you're suggesting Galusine, um, what is there that we gain by imagining other scenes in that series, or many overlapping geostories, to use the other term that you've taken in your essay? And I was wondering, should we still name epochs at all? Or should we rather move away from this naming of epochs, or thinking along the lines of epochs, and think more about plural relational geostories instead of geological eras?
Mm. I think that's a wonderful question. So geostories, I think, is a concept which I cite from Bruno Latour, and I think Bruno Latour is really advocating that we have many stories so that we can have a much thicker description of the time period that we live in. And I think that's what I hope to do with uh, Galassin concept. I mean, many other scholars are focusing on other aspects of the current epic. For example, islands. There's many scholars working on islands. I mean, we've talked about capitalism and the capitalist scene. Um, and so I think these as stories, I think it's great. I think that's what we do as scholars. We tell stories, and there's many stories to tell, and the more stories that we tell, the kind of deeper and thicker understanding we have of the current era. But I think you make a good point about whether we should keep naming scenes. And I think it's important to recognize this article that we're talking about was published 2 years ago in 2023, but in 2024, the International Union of Geological Scientists, the IUGS, they rejected the idea of the Anthropocene. So they formally went through a process, I think, starting in 2007. They formed the Anthropocene Working Group. The Anthropocene Working Group did a lot of research to kind of describe what a potential new era would be. And as geological background, what makes an epic for geologists is there's a field called stratigraphy, which relates to the different layers of the Earth's crust, the Earth's rock. Like you can see each epic in the rock formation, and they often choose a kind of golden spike point, and this is like the beginning of a new epic or era. So that's what this Anthropocene working group was doing: is finding, is there a layer in the Earth's crust that we can name? Does it designate a change big enough to make a new epic? And the Anthropocene Working Group, they voted that it did, but the greater geological community voted that it didn't. And I think in the meantime, like, I think that this article actually comes out of the work of the Anthropocene Working Group, because in 2016, they started publishing, well, first they started some announcements that were published in the media, like The Guardian. Damien Carrington is one of the first authors I saw that wrote about the idea of chickens being a marker. So the Anthropocene Working Group is the one that started talking about Gallus is consumed so greatly. There's so many bones, and the deformation, the changes in morphology of the chicken has been so great that it actually can become a geological marker. So that's where the idea for this article sprung, real geological evidence. But I think that the discussion in the humanities and social sciences, to some extent, has been disassociated with the geology behind the idea of the Anthropocene. And personally, I think that humanities and social sciences, we don't have periodization of world history. We never have. The geologists have, from the beginning of the Earth to the present, they have different epochs and periods um, and ages, all delineated. And so Anthropocene was a potential addition to that system, but we don't have that in social science and humanities. I mean, we could create a periodization system, but we don't have one. So I think that when many people take the concept of Anthropocene in the humanities and social sciences in fields without periodization, it becomes a kind of theoretical tool rather than a period. And that's a very different thing. That's a very different thing. And I think we can do the stories without the periodization. I mean, there is a lot of change going on now, and we need to mark that change. I think that's important. But when we define it in terms of geological epochs, I think to some extent we have to leave that to the geologists. and now that they've rejected the idea, maybe we should rethink whether we want to continue using that idea. And there's some other reasons that about the history of the Anthropocene itself, which I could talk about, but I've already talked a long time. So yeah, I'll just leave that answer there, and then I'll follow up with any other questions related to
No,
Uh,
but we do like long answers. They help us
it.
think, they give us clarity. So you're very welcome to do that. Susan, go ahead. I think you have a question.
Yeah, yeah, I wanted to talk a bit about domestication because you addressed that too in the essay. And I think, especially when it comes to domestic animals, that's one of the easiest ways to kind of take subjectivity out of the picture. Uh, I I think I just had a conversation with a colleague a few weeks back, and I was telling him about how a student had written about peacocks being vigilant, as she wrote that they're vigilant, but it's also a kind of labor for them, right? They're because there are peacocks on our campus, so they're actively working to be vigilant. So I was telling my colleague that, that helped me think a bit differently about, let's say, cows, because if you observe cows, you just observe them eating a lot, but it's also a kind of labor. It doesn't mean they're stupid or that this is all they do. It's not like that makes their lives any less richer. So then my colleague responded that, well, peacocks and cows are different because cows are domesticated, and therefore they're in this trap of where there is no subjectivity, right? But in your essay, you kind of push back against that as well. But it's complicated and it's difficult to do, which is why you connect to the Les Beldo article as well. So could you tell us a bit about how we can think about subjectivity, especially in systems that confine animals, systems that trap animals, where it looks like, even for multi-species ethnographers who rely on observation, that there is no subjectivity?
Yeah, thank you for this question. That's a very good question, and a very complicated question. I mean, I think what's so fascinating about this concept of domestication, humans are actually domesticated too, and I think that's that's an important thing in evolutionary anthropology. And this is not cultural anthropology, so it's more biological biology, biologists talking about this. Um, but they came up with a set of traits which I talked about in this article, which, interestingly enough, part of the domestication process actually creates smaller brains, a different shape of the forehead. I mean, certain behaviors, like in dogs, dogs will approach humans more. Um, but pretty much these indicators of domestication, humans also have. So our brains actually shrunk on average during that so-called agricultural revolution, and a lot of other features associated with the skull shape and different things. Like there's also things with happen with hair color or fur color, ear shape, um, and humans were also domesticated from this biological definition. We were adapting to interact with other humans and other non-humans, which is what this process of domestication is. Um, so, I mean, original concept of domestication is you're bringing in some species into your home, and the home presumably is the human home, and then it's humans that are actively going out and finding animals like dogs and saying, dogs are useful for us, so we'll take dogs into our home, and then we'll breed them in such a way that they'll be friendly to us and they can live with us. And that sounds all very intentional, that humans intentionally go out and breed. And there is some human breeding, mainly in the last 100 to 150 years, for dogs, where we try to get them to look at like different distinct species, different distinct breeds. But that's not how dog-human domestication originally started. I mean, I think in India there also are these type of dogs that are just kind of city dogs, that they're not some kind of breed. They just run around and they interbreed with each other and essentially are breeding themselves through the interaction with the environment of what James Scott calls the domus. Um, so there was nothing intentional going on in this relationship in the beginning. It may be that dogs just approach humans because there were things that they could eat, and humans also saw dogs as useful because they could hunt, and so it was a mutually beneficial relationship with both sides interacting and reacting to others. And we can see that even at the biological level that I described, that the shape of the skull is changing and the size of the brains are changing, the color of fur or hair is changing, the shape of ears is changing. Um, all these genetic markers of this happening. And so if humans are also having these changes, it's hard to imagine that humans were the only active agents going out and causing all of these changes. Um, but it's a lot for people to really put their arms around, that domestication is not a human-led thing, and that other species have an active process in that. In fact, the whole idea of domestication is problematic in some ways. And I mean, I think it's interesting in biology how they've approached it, because they've kind of taken a lot of the agency out of the idea in general by making it a kind of set of physical traits that are identifiable and can be induced in experiments, like the famous foxes in Russia, where just by selecting for friendliness, the whole set of biological traits that were selected for changed. And knowing that that happened to humans too makes the story a lot more interesting and complex, I think.
And related to that, I wanted to ask you to kind of talk a bit about subjectivity, because that's another concept that's been coming up a lot, and it's something that we're really interested in. And in the last talk, for example, we had Jonathan Dickstein talking about gen ethics, and he was talking about the concept of sentience, and that sounded a lot like subjectivity. And not so much about whether an animal has consciousness or not. Whereas in your essay, you talk about subjectivity as something. Is it something that is already present, that don't need to be defined in Cartesian terms, like you have a mind that has these desires or dreams? Is it already present in non-human beings?
In non-human beings, yeah, that this is a it's a very difficult question, and I don't know that I have a full answer for this question, but it's certainly something that I've thought about a lot. For example,
And
my
just to add, because I know you make that distinction between, you kind of push back against Bruno Latour's promiscuous view of non-human agency, right? And it's interesting because in the last talk too, we had this discussion about whether the rock is worthy of moral consideration, and Anu said yes, the rock is. Whereas Jonathan was saying, we have to take a pragmatic approach. But I feel like that's not what you're advocating for, but you're still kind of saying, yes, there is a distinction to be made here.
Yeah. Oh, I'm glad you brought that up, because I think it's Les Beldo who used the word of promiscuous describing Bruno Latour's concept of subjectivity. And I think that Les Beldo is making a very important point there. And I was going to mention, I talked about it with Michael Hathaway, who wrote this book on mushrooms. There's a series of 3 books on mushrooms with Anna Singh and Michael Hathaway. I think the third one hasn't been published yet. But a lot of what that project is doing is talking about the agency of mushrooms. And I think that's really important. And it is a form of subjectivity. Like you mentioned, like we can talk about the subjectivity of rocks. And Bruno Latour is promoting us to do that. I mean, at least at an actor level, that there's actor networks that have agency, but all of these actors, to some extent, have some form of partial subjectivity in the network. But I I think that's important. But it also gets back to my earlier point of what I was doing in this essay about the ethics of the situation, because in my discussions with Michael Hathaway, he's talking about agency and saying, maybe you have all these vegetarians, they don't eat meat, but they eat mushrooms, but mushrooms are these dynamic, agential, subjective creatures. So should we eat mushrooms? And this is what I think that Les Beldo is calling promiscuous in this sense of subjectivity, because, okay, so let's accept that non-humans, non-animals have some form of agency. They do things in the world. I believe that. But then you also have to come back to the question of suffering. And so there's a separate question, I think, of is something doing something in the world, and is something suffering or feeling pleasure or feeling fulfillment in the world? And I don't think that there's a perfect overlap between these two questions. So why are people vegetarians? They're usually vegetarian because, I mean, well, it can be religious reasons. I guess Hindus and Buddhists are, and Jains, the Jains are vegetarian. But often those religious rules are related to some form of suffering of the other, because the other doesn't want to die, doesn't want to suffer, because they have this feeling of sentience, like you were talking about. And sentience can be described in two different ways: the ability to act and do things in the world, and the ability to feel. And I guess I want to ask the question, are these two things the same? Because I don't think they're necessarily the same. I don't necessarily think things that do things in the world are the same things that feel things in the world. And both of those things, I think, can be described as subjectivity. But both of these questions are very difficult, because sentience, feeling, it's impossible to know what other things feel and what other things don't, unless you are those things, but you're only one thing, right? You're only yourself. So it's hard to say how far out feeling goes. I mean, what if it is true that rocks can feel? Well, if rocks can feel, then I think we shouldn't make them suffer. But I don't suspect, at least in my own understanding of reality, I don't really think in my heart of hearts that rocks feel. Although I can see the argument that they do things in the world. I think that argument is stronger. I mean, the continents are moving and mountains are rising and things are happening. And oftentimes these things respond to humans, like humans burn things, and these things like carbon dioxide, they get planted in rocks, they change the climate, so they're doing things. But are they feeling things? At this point, I don't think there's enough evidence to say that carbon dioxide feels things. I don't think there's enough evidence to say rocks feel things. So I guess I would pose two forms, at least two. There may be more, but at least two forms of subjectivity, one involving feeling and one involving agency. And that's what I was kind of bringing up at the beginning, because I think that these two things get conflated.
Right. I just have a quick follow-up before we take Parth's question, which is that, and again, I understand the distinction you're making, but could it limit us to acknowledging the subjectivity of those who share the same worlds? Like, for example, if I'm in a garden with a dog and many different birds who I cannot see very clearly, then I'm more likely to be attuned to the dog's umwelt or the dog's subjectivity and kind of ignore the birds. And so, and I'm thinking, I mentioned this. I'll. There are two counter examples. For example, in the Star Trek episode, there's a rock with a who's a silicon-based life form. So the officers don't register that till they figure out that it's not a carbon-based life form. So then that means that living beings of other ontologies could also slip through the cracks. The other counterexample is, what about beings, and you mentioned viruses, what about beings that we don't like pests, or wild boars, for example, who, this sometimes deemed vermin and therefore can be killed, even though biology tells us that there are social ties and so on. So then, if we are to define subjectivity as based on how beings feel, then as human beings, wouldn't that mean recognizing them based on how we feel?
Yeah, I think there's some inevitability about that. I think you make a good point. We're asking a question that, as far as I know, can't be known with 100% certitude. Although I should say, I mean, I'm trained in religious studies and Buddhist studies in particular. I work with indigenous people who are not Buddhist but Christian as well, and their indigenous systems. And so I pay particular attention to the kind of different systems and how they demarcate what can feel and can't feel. And for example, we just hosted Peter Singer, and he's been in dialogue. They published a book with a nun that works here at my university, Shi Jiahui, in Taiwan. She's a Buddhist nun, and they have a discussion about utilitarianism. I'm very interested in this discussion because it speaks to the questions that you're asking. And Jiahui as a Buddhist, and Peter Singer as a what I call a naturalist. He's actually a utilitarian thinker. So this is also how I'm separating ethics from metaphysics, because I think Peter Singer is a utilitarian as a utilitarian. He wants to maximize benefit. That's the definition of utilitarian. And from that definition of utilitarian, Buddhists also want to maximize benefit. Actually, Jiahui and Peter Singer agree on this point. You maximize benefit. But how you maximize benefit doesn't only depend, and doesn't at all maybe depend on your ethical view. It depends on your view of the universe and the facts of the universe. And that's where we get into this discussion, because the way that Peter Singer and Shi Jiahui see the facts are very different. So Peter Singer, when he defines suffering, he looks at what we can see, like the kind of yelps of pain, the kind of anguish in the expression, um, the nervous system activity that's going on at that time. If you are used to use some kind of scanning device that neuroscientists use. So this is a very physicalist definition, and it's one definition. Whereas Shi Jiahui, as a Buddhist, she believes that if you meditate, instead of using this kind of scientific way of exploration, her way of knowing, her epistemology is based on this idea that you have to advance yourself through meditation. And as you meditate, you'll have a subtler understanding, a perception of reality. And she thinks that when you reach a point subtle enough, you will actually be able to sense the feelings of other beings. That there's some kind of channel of communication between beings that you'll be able to sense. And for her in Buddhism, that also is only animals. I mean, yes, in Buddhism, there's also some way to see like the whole universe as being interconnected, but mainly from a practical level, it's animals that have this capacity to sense. Well, there's going to be debate about where the line should be about things that feel, and in the in this movement, in this post-human movement in social sciences and humanities, many people are pushing out and saying we need to recognize other species than humans. but I think they're more focused on agency, as in doing things in the world, broadening this term, and not as carefully as evaluating the sentience part and the different definitions of sentience and how far out it can go. I mean, there are some people um, that are saying, yeah, actually, maybe all material objects have some form of sentience and feelings. And there's more in post-human scholarship moving in that direction. But that goes against many other systems, like the Buddhist one I described and the naturalist one I described. And so which one do we choose? I cannot give you a definite answer on this question, but it is something that I pay attention to from an anthropological perspective, like mapping out these different systems of sentience. And I really think that at least the people that I study, even the indigenous people in the mountains that are not Buddhist, and their systems, and I ask them about this, and generally, some of them don't even tell me that all animals are sentient. So the idea that mushrooms, for example, are sentient is pushing it out quite far. I'm personally not ready to accept that. I'm open to that possibility if you can show me something, but it's against my intuition, and at this point, that's the best that I can work with, I guess.
All right. Jeffrey, it's almost time, but could you take one more question from Parth?
Yeah, sure.
Hi, Jeffrey. Am I audible?
Yes, I can hear you.
Hi, Jeffrey. I'm Parth. I'm a PhD student at the University of Toronto. Your article was really wonderful. I learned a lot. My questions were more historical than philosophical, and it would really suck if mushrooms were sentient because I just got a packet last night. So that would be terrible. So my questions were more related to historical approach. I had two questions, but in the interest of time, I'll just ask one. So when you were mentioning about the Chicken of Tomorrow competition that started, so you were mentioning how the competitors were really occupied by producing this wide breed of chickens. And I was really interested in the question of racialization of animal bodies that is going on in there. And I also noticed that most of the chickens in India are also white unless you go to an organic farm. So maybe just could you briefly talk about that? And thank you so much again.
Yeah. Uh, thanks, Parth. That's a great question. I don't think that the breeders were interested in the color of the feathers as much as the color of the meat. So color was an important factor, but when when the meat is sold in the market, um, already it's been defeathered. So what people see is not the color of the feathers, but they see the color of the meat. And I think there was a whitening of the meat. So, which is, I don't even know how to think about that in racial terms, because race is often related to color, but not necessarily the color of the internal meat. Um, so I guess all I can say about that is that, yes, color was important in the way that they bred these animals. And it was a form of cleanliness. And I think that there was maybe an element of the white feathers because people thought it was more clean looking. And that could be something related to racial biases. Um, but I think the color of the meat was more important than the color of the feathers. But it was an idea of the idea that these colors were more appealing because they looked more clean and they would sell for higher values. Um, so yeah, it wasn't the focus of my essay, but I could imagine that that would be another question that deserves some more attention. So I think that's a good point you raise.
All right.
Thank
Uh,
you so much.
Thank
Thanks
you.
for spending this 1 hour with us. It's such a dense, complicated essay with so many ideas. It's been so great talking to you. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. It's a pleasure meeting you, Susan and Anu and Parth and everyone today. Thank you for being here. I really enjoyed it.